Chapter 1. The Walkthrough. The first thing Evan realized was that the ceiling was too expensive. It was vaulted, painted with a subtle Renaissance fresco, and lined with crown molding that probably cost more than his entire college tuition in his previous life. The second thing he realized was the pounding, agonizing headache radiating from the base of his skull. Evan sat up, clutching his temples. He was lying in a king-sized bed wrapped in silk sheets. He looked down at his hands. They were smooth, uncalloused, and currently wearing a platinum Patek Philippe watch. These were not his hands. Memories that didn't belong to him slammed into his brain like a freight train. Evan Cross, 22 years old, youngest son of the Cross family, the useless, arrogant, wildly hated heir to Cross Holdings. "You've got to be kidding me," Evan muttered. His voice sounded deeper, richer than he remembered. He knew that name. He knew this family. Before the accident that abruptly ended his original life, he had been reading a massive, terribly paced financial thriller web novel. The Cross family was the central tragedy of that book. They were the titans of global industry who were systematically dismantled, betrayed, and destroyed by their enemies over the course of 300 chapters. And Evan Cross, the character whose body he now inhabited, he was the catalyst for the family's downfall. The idiot son who signed the wrong papers, trusted the wrong people, and died a pathetic death in the first act. Evan stumbled out of bed, nearly tripping over a pair of velvet slippers. He made his way to the en-suite bathroom and stared into the mirror. Dark hair, sharp jawline, and pale, exhausted eyes. He looked like a billionaire. He felt like a guy who had just been hit by a bus. Suddenly, a soft chime echoed in the quiet room. It wasn't a speaker. The sound came from the sleek, black smartphone resting on the marble vanity. Evan picked it up. The screen unlocked seamlessly, recognizing his face. There was only one application open. The icon was a simple, glowing golden hourglass. The text on the screen read, "Future walkthrough, status, 100% complete." Evan frowned. He tapped the screen. The app unfolded into a massive, heavily detailed index. It was a chapter-by-chapter record of the original novel he had read, but structured like a classified intelligence dossier. It didn't read like fiction. It read like absolute, unchangeable history. He scrolled down. Chapter 12. Adrian Cross loses the Eurotech bid. Chapter 34. Victor Cross indicted for corporate espionage. Chapter 56. The collapse of Cross Holdings. He kept scrolling, a cold knot forming in his stomach, until he found the entry he was looking for. Chapter 87. Evan Cross dies. He tapped the entry. The text was brutally brief. Location, Pier 44. Cause of death, drowning. Orchestrated by, unknown. The death of the youngest heir permanently fractures the psychological stability of Victor and Eleanor Cross, allowing the hostile takeover to commence. Evan stared at the glowing screen. In his original life, he had been a completely average guy. He worked an average job, paid average rent, and died an incredibly average death. Now, he was sitting on a mountain of wealth, strapped to a ticking time bomb. If he did exactly what the original Evan did, he had exactly 87 days to live. Evan locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket. He looked back up at the mirror. He took a deep breath, forcing the panic down into a tight, manageable box in his chest. "I'm not following this story," Evan said to his reflection. "If I'm going to die, it's not going to be on Pier 40-4. He walked out of the bathroom. It was time to meet the family he was about to accidentally save. Chapter 2. The First Cheat. The Cross family dining room looked less like a place to eat breakfast and more like a high-stakes corporate boardroom. When Evan walked in, the tension was already thick enough to choke on. At the head of the table sat Victor Cross. The billionaire patriarch had eyes like chipped flint and a posture that demanded immediate obedience. To his right sat Adrian, Evan's older brother, currently scrolling furiously through an iPad. Adrian was the golden child, the corporate prodigy being groomed for the CEO's seat. "The Vanguard merger has to close today, Adrian," Victor said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If we delay until Monday, the European regulators will smell blood in the water. Sign the papers." "I'm reviewing the final liability clauses, Dad," Adrian said tightly. "Vanguard CEO, Richard Vance, is pushing for an expedited transfer. It feels rushed. It feels expedited because it is efficient," Victor snapped. "Sign it." Evan stood frozen in the doorway. He slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the walkthrough under the guise of checking a text. He searched the index for Vanguard merger. The text appeared instantly. Original event. Adrian Cross signs the Vanguard merger. The following morning, Vanguard CEO Richard Vance is indicted by federal authorities for running a massive Ponzi scheme. The toxic debt is legally absorbed by Cross Holdings, plunging the company into a 3-year financial crisis. Evan's heart hammered against his ribs. If he signs that paper, the family loses $1 billion tomorrow. Evan shoved the phone back into his pocket. He had to stop it. But the original Evan Cross was a lazy, arrogant idiot. If he suddenly started giving financial advice, they would laugh him out of the room. He needed to act like a billionaire. He needed to be cold. Evan walked to the table and casually pulled out his chair. The scraping sound drew the irritated gazes of both his father and brother. "Don't sign it," Evan said flatly, reaching for a silver carafe to pour himself coffee. Adrian stopped typing. He looked at Evan as if a golden retriever had just attempted to explain quantum physics. "Excuse me." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Evan, this is business. Go back to whatever country club you sleep at." Evan took a sip of his coffee. His hands were shaking slightly, so he gripped the ceramic mug tighter to hide it. "I said, don't sign it," Evan repeated, forcing his voice to remain steady and bored. "Richard Vance is a dead man walking." "What are you talking about?" Adrian demanded, his patience evaporating. "Vanguard is posting record profits." "They are posting fiction," Evan said. He leaned back in his chair, channeling every ounce of fake confidence he possessed. "If you sign that contract today, Adrian, by 9 a.m. tomorrow, the feds will raid Vance's office. You'll be strapping $1 billion anchor to our hull." The dining room went dead silent. Victor stared at his youngest son. "Who told you this?" "A magical app on my iPhone," Evan thought wildly. "Let's just call it a reliable intuition," Evan said aloud, giving a dismissive wave of his hand. "Delay the signing by 24 hours. Make an excuse. Tell them the legal team found a typo. If I'm wrong, sign it tomorrow. If I'm right, I just saved this family a decade of litigation." Adrian scoffed. "Dad, this is absurd. He doesn't know anything about the Vanguard financials." Victor didn't look at Adrian. He kept his eyes locked on Evan. For the first time, Victor didn't see the arrogant, useless boy he was used to. He saw a cold, calculating stillness. "Delay the signing," Victor ordered quietly. "Dad, I said delay it, Adrian. 24 hours. Victor stood up, tossing his napkin onto the table. He looked at Evan one last time before walking out of the room. Evan took another slow sip of coffee. "Holy crap, it worked," he screamed internally. "I am having a heart attack. My chest actually hurts." The next morning, Evan was sitting in his bedroom when his phone buzzed. It wasn't the walkthrough. It was a breaking news alert. Vanguard CEO Richard Vance arrested in dawn raid. Massive fraud uncovered. A second later, his bedroom door burst open. Adrian stood in the doorway, staring at Evan with wide, shell-shocked eyes. "How did you know?" Adrian whispered. Evan looked up from his phone. He put on a calm, mysterious smile. "I read the writing on the wall, Adrian. I literally read the writing on my phone." His internal monologue panicked. "Please stop staring at me like I'm a wizard." Adrian slowly backed out of the room, closing the door reverently. Evan exhaled a massive breath and slumped back onto his pillows. He pulled out the walkthrough app. A new notification glowed at the top of the screen. Timeline deviation detected, 1.7%. Original event altered. Calculating future ripples. Evan stared at the notification. He had saved the company. But the future was no longer exactly the same. Chapter 3. The Perfect Decision. The fallout from the Vanguard collapse changed the atmosphere in the Cross Mansion overnight. Suddenly, Evan wasn't just the family disappointment. He was an enigma. 2 days later, Adrian knocked on the door of Evan's home office, a room Evan had occupied precisely twice in the last 4 years. "Enter," Evan called out, hastily closing a tab on his computer where he had been desperately trying to learn basic accounting terms on Investopedia. Adrian walked in, carrying a thick leather binder. He looked at Evan with a bizarre mixture of sibling rivalry and profound intellectual respect. "I have a problem, Evan," Adrian said, setting the binder on the mahogany desk. "And since your intuition saved us $1 billion, Dad suggested I run this by you." Evan looked at the binder. "Please don't be math. Please don't be math. I'm attempting to acquire a mid-level tech startup to bolster our logistics division, Adrian explained, pacing the room. Outsmarting. They have the market cornered on predictive shipping software. It's a solid bet, but the asking price is aggressive. I want your read on it. Evan casually opened a drawer, slipping his phone out so it rested on his lap beneath the desk. He opened the walkthrough. Search, Outsmarting acquisition. The entry appeared immediately. Original event. Adrian acquires Outsmarting. 6 weeks later, a massive patent infringement lawsuit reveals Outsmarting stole their core algorithm from a bankrupt competitor named Novashell. Outsmarting's value drops to 0. Evan winced internally. Adrian, my man, you are terrible at this. Don't buy Outsmarting, Evan said flatly. Adrian stopped pacing. He frowned. Why? The projections are flawless. Their code is stolen, Evan said, reading directly off his screen. If you buy them, you're buying a lawsuit. Drop the bid entirely. Then who do we acquire? Adrian demanded. We need the logistics software to secure the European contracts next quarter. Evan scrolled down on the app. Note, the original patent belongs to Novashell, a nearly bankrupt shell company currently trading for pennies. 3 months later, Novashell is awarded a massive Department of Defense contract, catapulting its value into the billions. By Novashell, Evan said, leaning back and crossing his arms. Adrian stared at him. Novashell? Evan, they are practically insolvent. They operate out of a strip mall in New Jersey. Buying them makes zero strategic sense. Then you aren't looking at the right strategy, Evan said coldly. Buy Novashell today. Buy it quietly. Give me 3 months. If it doesn't pay out tenfold, you can have my shares in the trust. Adrian looked at his younger brother. The absolute, unshakable confidence in Evan's eyes was terrifying. Adrian nodded slowly, grabbed his binder, and walked out. Evan dropped his head onto the desk. I am betting my entire trust fund on a phone app. I am going to die poor. 3 days later, Adrian burst into Victor's private study, carrying a stack of printed charts. Victor and Eleanor were having morning tea. I figured it out, Adrian said, his eyes wide and slightly manic. Evan's Novashell play. I spent 72 hours reverse engineering the logic. Victor set his teacup down. Explain. Adrian threw the charts onto the table. Novashell looks bankrupt, but they hold a dormant patent for a specific supply chain encryption model. Evan must have known that the Department of Defense is currently restructuring their domestic shipping guidelines to require that exact type of encryption. By acquiring the patent holder now, Evan didn't just buy a company. He bought the bottleneck for the entire federal logistics grid. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Our Evan thought of that. It's a 12-step macroeconomic sequence, Adrian said, wiping sweat from his forehead. It requires an intimate knowledge of federal defense policy, patent law, and international shipping deficits. It's brilliant. It's utterly, terrifyingly brilliant. Outside the study door, Evan was standing perfectly still, holding a cup of coffee. He had heard the entire conversation. I didn't think of literally any of that, Evan screamed internally. The app just said, by Novashell. I don't even know what an encryption bottleneck is. Evan quickly turned around and tiptoed back down the hallway, terrified that if he opened his mouth, he would instantly shatter his own illusion. Chapter 4, The Family Test. Claire Cross, 19 years old, chaotic, and aggressively perceptive, did not believe in miracles. She sat on the edge of the kitchen island, swinging her legs, watching Evan attempt to use the espresso machine. You're holding the portafilter wrong, Claire noted, sipping a green smoothie. I know how to make coffee, Claire, Evan muttered, burning his thumb on the steam wand. Since when? She countered. A month ago you didn't know how to boil water. Now you're the Wolf of Wall Street. Adrian hasn't slept in 3 days because he's trying to figure out how you predicted the rubber market fluctuations. Evan kept his eyes on the espresso. People change. Claire hopped off the counter. She walked over, leaning against the marble next to him. She had a mischievous, calculating glint in her eye. Okay, Nostradamus, Claire said smoothly. Let's test this sudden genius. I have a friend whose father is considering a massive investment in a biomedical firm called Genesis Bio. What's your read? Evan froze. Genesis Bio? He hadn't searched that in the walkthrough. He had no idea what it was. He needed an excuse to check his phone. Hold on, Evan said, reaching into his pocket. I'm getting an urgent text from Dad. He pulled out the phone, angling it away from Claire. He frantically typed Genesis bio into the walkthrough search bar. Result: 0 matches found. Evan panicked. 0 matches? Why isn't it in the book? Does it go bankrupt before the story starts? He looked at Claire. She was watching him like a hawk, a smug little smile playing on her lips. Wait. The walkthrough contained the complete history of the world's major financial and social events. If Genesis Bio was a real, massive investment, it would be in the records. Unless it wasn't real. Evan slowly lowered his phone. He looked Claire dead in the eye. Nice try, Claire, Evan said, his voice flat and unimpressed. Claire's smile faltered. What do you mean? There is no investment. Genesis Bio doesn't exist, Evan said, turning back to his espresso. You made it up to test me. Do you really think I don't verify my data before speaking? Claire stared at the back of his head. The smugness vanished entirely, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. She had made it up. She had invented the name 3 seconds ago just to see if he would bluff his way through an answer. Instead, he had caught the lie instantly, without even looking up from the coffee machine. You're a freak, Evan, Claire whispered, grabbing her smoothie and hurrying out of the kitchen. Evan waited until her footsteps faded down the hall. He leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, letting out a long, shaky breath. I am going to have a stroke, Evan thought, wiping sweat from his forehead. She is a literal demon child. I survived that entirely by accident. Upstairs, Claire walked into Adrian's room. Well, Adrian asked, looking up from his charts. He's not faking, Claire said, looking a little pale. I threw a completely fabricated variable at him to test his market knowledge. He didn't even blink. He called the bluff in 2 seconds. Adrian, I think he actually knows everything. Adrian nodded slowly, tapping his pen. We need to study his methods. Whatever game he is playing, he is 10 steps ahead of all of us. Chapter 5, The Gala. The annual Obsidian Charity Gala was a gathering of the wealthiest predators in North America. It was held in the grand ballroom of a historic Manhattan hotel, dripping with crystal and old money. Evan hated it immediately. He stood near a towering ice sculpture of an eagle, swirling a glass of sparkling water. His tuxedo was suffocatingly tight. He pulled his phone out. Chapter 14, The Obsidian Gala. Original event. During the keynote speech, a disgruntled former employee disguised as a waiter attempts to poison Victor Cross with a lethal dose of ricin laced in a glass of 2012 Macallan Scotch. Victor consumes the drink and suffers catastrophic organ failure. He survives, but remains on life support for 6 months, leaving the company vulnerable. Evan's eyes locked onto the details. Waiter description: tall, blonde, scar on left jawline. Evan scanned the room. The gala was massive. There were 50 waiters in identical uniforms circling the room, holding silver trays. Looking for someone? A voice asked. Evan jumped slightly, turning around. Standing behind him was a woman in a sleek, dark emerald evening gown. She had sharp, intelligent eyes, dark hair swept over one shoulder, and held a champagne flute like a weapon. Amelia Hart, she introduced herself, stepping forward. We haven't met. I write for the Financial Times. Evan's internal alarm bells went off. He quickly checked his mental repository of the walkthrough. Amelia Hart. She was an investigative journalist. She was supposed to write a devastating exposé on Cross Holdings in Chapter 40. But she wasn't supposed to be interacting with him here. Evan Cross, he said, forcing a polite, distant smile. I don't typically do interviews at charity events. I'm not here for an interview, Mr. Cross, Amelia said, tilting her head. I'm here because I'm fascinated by you. 6 months ago, you were famous for crashing sports cars. Today, my sources tell me you single-handedly saved your family from the Vanguard collapse and orchestrated a brilliant shadow acquisition of Novashell. People talk, Evan said neutrally, scanning the room over her shoulder. Where's the waiter? They do, Amelia agreed. And I usually find that when a man undergoes a complete psychological and intellectual transformation overnight, he's hiding something. Evan finally looked directly at her. She wasn't just making small talk. She was hunting. Ms. Hart, Evan said, his voice dropping into his cold, untouchable persona. If I were hiding something, you wouldn't be the one to find it. He stepped past her, ending the conversation. He had spotted him. A tall, blonde waiter with a faint white scar on his jaw was moving smoothly through the crowd. carrying a silver tray with a single crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He was heading straight for the front table, where Victor Cross was sitting. Evan moved quickly, cutting through the crowd. He intercepted the waiter just as he reached the edge of Victor's table. "Excuse me," Evan said loudly, stepping directly into the waiter's path. The waiter startled, almost dropping the tray. "Sir." Victor looked up from his conversation, frowning at the interruption. "Evan, what are you doing?" Evan didn't look at his father. He looked at the tumbler of scotch. "I'll take that," Evan said, reaching out and plucking the glass from the silver tray. The waiter's face paled. "Sir, that was requested specifically for your father." "I don't care," Evan sneered arrogantly. He lifted the glass, pretending to inspect the amber liquid. He brought it to his nose and sniffed. "Smells like scotch," Evan thought. "I really hope the app is right, because if I just stole my dad's drink for no reason, I am going to look like an absolute lunatic." "This is Macallan 2012, Evan said loudly, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. "I told the catering staff we only serve the 2008 for the VIP tables. This is swill." Evan casually tossed the glass over his shoulder. The crystal shattered loudly on the marble floor. The amber liquid splashed across the polished stone. The room went silent. "Evan," Victor hissed, standing up, embarrassed by the sudden, childish display. The waiter looked terrified. He took a step backward, preparing to run. Evan grabbed the waiter by the collar of his uniform, pulling him close. "Walk out the service doors right now," Evan whispered into the man's ear, his voice deadly and quiet. "If I ever see your face in this city again, I won't just fire you. I'll make sure you disappear. Do you understand?" The man, realizing his assassination plot had somehow been uncovered, nodded frantically. Evan shoved him away. The man turned and practically sprinted toward the kitchen exits. Evan turned back to his father, straightening his suit jacket. "You're welcome, Dad," Evan said softly. "The 2008 is much better for your health." He walked away, leaving his father standing in stunned silence. As Evan crossed the ballroom, he noticed Amelia Hart watching him from the bar. She wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. She was looking at the small, sizzling burn marks where the spilled scotch was subtly eating into the varnish of the marble floor. Amelia looked up, her eyes locking onto Evan. She saw it. Evan panicked internally. "She knows I didn't just throw a tantrum. She knows I just stopped a murder." Chapter 6. The First Unknown. Evan retreated to the outdoor terrace of the hotel, desperately needing air. His heart was beating out of his chest. He had just stopped a murder. He had literally saved his father's life by throwing a tantrum like a spoiled toddler. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly. He opened the walkthrough. A red banner flashed at the top of the screen. Timeline deviation detected, 8.4%. Original event altered. Victor Cross assassination prevented. Calculating butterfly effect. Evan exhaled sharply. 8.4%. The timeline was shifting rapidly. He was breaking the original story. The terrace door opened. Amelia Hart stepped out into the cool night air. She didn't have her champagne anymore. She held a small, leather notebook. "Ricin," Amelia said softly, closing the terrace door behind her. "That's what was in the glass, wasn't it?" Evan didn't turn around. He leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out at the city lights. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Hart. It was just a bad vintage." Amelia walked up beside him. "I investigated the catering staff while you were walking out." The man with the scar? He wasn't on the approved vendor list. He bypassed a multi-million-dollar security perimeter. She turned to look at him, her sharp eyes searching his face. "You didn't just throw a tantrum, Evan," Amelia said. "You identified an assassin in a crowded room, intercepted the payload, and neutralized the threat without causing a panic that would have tanked Cross Holdings' stock price. And you did it by playing the role of the spoiled brat perfectly." Evan kept his face blank. "I am not playing a role. I am genuinely sweating through my undershirt right now." "You have an active imagination, Amelia," Evan said coolly. "I have a degree in investigative journalism," she countered. "I came here tonight to figure out how a useless playboy suddenly became a financial mastermind. And what I just saw was a man operating 10 steps ahead of his own security detail." She stepped closer, invading his personal space. "Who are you, Evan Cross?" she whispered. "Because you certainly aren't the man the media thinks you are." Evan looked at her. For the first time, he realized that changing the future didn't just erase bad events. It created new ones. Amelia Hart was investigating him months before she was supposed to. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It wasn't the walkthrough. It was a standard text message. He pulled it out. Message from Adrian. Emergency. The Port Authority in Rotterdam just declared a wildcat strike. Our entire European fleet is grounded. Dad is furious. Get to the office. Evan frowned. He quickly opened the walkthrough app, shielding the screen from Amelia. Search, Rotterdam strike. The app loaded for a second before displaying. Result: 0 matches found. Event did not occur in the original timeline. Evan's blood ran cold. A massive logistics strike. It wasn't in the book. It wasn't supposed to happen. Something wrong? Amelia asked, noticing the sudden shift in his posture. The arrogant mask had slipped for a fraction of a second. Evan shoved the phone back into his pocket. He looked at the journalist. The future is reacting, Evan realized, a deep, creeping terror settling into his bones. I saved the company from Vanguard. I saved Dad from the poison. And now, the timeline is throwing punches I can't see coming. I have to go, Evan said, pushing past her. For the first time since he woke up in this body, Evan Cross was flying blind. Chapter 7, Mother Knows. The executive floor of Cross Holdings was a war zone. Assistants were running down hallways. Phones were ringing endlessly. When Evan stepped out of the elevator, Adrian nearly collided with him, holding a stack of shipping manifests. It's a disaster, Adrian barked, not even stopping. The strike isn't about wages. The union leaders in Rotterdam are claiming our ships are carrying undeclared hazardous materials. Customs is locking down the fleet. If we miss the delivery window for the German contracts, we forfeit the entire European sector. Evan followed him into the main boardroom. Victor was already there, shouting at someone in German on a speakerphone. Evan sat in the corner. He opened the walkthrough under the table. If the strike wasn't in the original timeline, then it was a direct consequence of his actions. What did he change? He stopped the Vanguard merger. Richard Vance, the Vanguard CEO, was arrested. Evan typed rapidly into the app, Richard Vance assets. The app generated a hit. Original timeline note. Richard Vance secretly owned a subsidiary shell company called Black Tide Logistics, which he used to smuggle unregistered chemical components through Rotterdam. Evan's eyes widened. When he stopped the Vanguard merger, the feds raided Richard Vance. But they must have missed the shell company. The shell company's assets were likely stranded on the docks, and the union panicked, blaming Cross Holdings because they were the primary operator at the port. I caused this, Evan realized. Evan, a quiet voice said. He looked up. Eleanor Cross was standing in the doorway of the boardroom. She wasn't shouting. She didn't look panicked. She looked perfectly composed, holding a file folder. She gestured for him to follow her. Evan slipped out of the boardroom and followed his mother down the hall into a quiet, soundproofed private lounge. Eleanor closed the door. She poured 2 cups of tea from a silver service on the table. She handed one to Evan. Chamomile, Eleanor said softly. You used to hate it. You said it tasted like dirt. Evan took the cup. I acquired a taste for it. Eleanor sat down gracefully on the sofa. She looked at him. Her eyes were not the cold, calculating eyes of Victor, nor the competitive eyes of Adrian. They were deep, terrifyingly perceptive pools of emotional intelligence. You didn't hold the cup by the handle, Eleanor noted, taking a delicate sip of her own tea. You held it by the rim. You started doing that 3 weeks ago, after you woke up from your migraine. Evan froze. His hands clamped down on the warm ceramic. You also stopped tapping your left foot when you're impatient, she continued, her voice gentle, almost conversational. You use different vocabulary. You look at your brother with patience, not jealousy. And last night, at the gala, you saved your father's life without hesitating. Evan couldn't breathe. She knows. Oh my God, she knows I'm not him. Mom, I can explain. I don't need an explanation of how you knew about the poison, Evan. Eleanor interrupted softly. She placed her teacup on the table and leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his soul. I just want to ask you one question, Eleanor whispered. What are you running from? Evan stared at her. She wasn't accusing him of being an imposter. She was accusing him of carrying a crushing, invisible burden. I'm running from the end of the world, Evan thought, the sheer exhaustion of the last few weeks threatening to break him. I'm running from chapter 87. I'm running from all of you dying. He looked at his mother. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to show her the phone, the app, the looming doom. But if he told her, he would be admitting that their real son was gone. Evan forced a small, tired smile. He set the tea down. "I'm just growing up, Mom," Evan said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "I realized I didn't want to be the punchline anymore. I want to protect this family." Eleanor searched his face for a long time. Slowly, she smiled. It was a sad, beautiful smile. "You are carrying ghosts, my sweet boy," Eleanor murmured, standing up and smoothing the lapel of his jacket. "You don't have to carry them alone." She kissed his cheek and walked out of the lounge. Evan stood alone in the quiet room. He had survived the interrogation, but he knew with absolute certainty that his mother saw right through the genius facade. She saw the terrified kid underneath. He pulled out his phone. He needed to fix Rotterdam. He drafted an anonymous email to the federal prosecutor handling the Vanguard case, attaching the name of the Black Tide Shell Company and its connection to the hazardous materials on the docks. Let the feds clear the port, Evan thought, hitting send. He pocketed the phone and walked back into the war room to play his part. Chapter 8. The Stock Market Miracle. The Rotterdam crisis resolved itself exactly 12 hours later when federal authorities seized the Vanguard-affiliated cargo, publicly exonerating Cross Holdings. Adrian, of course, spent 3 hours explaining to Victor how Evan's delay of the Vanguard merger had preemptively shielded them from the international incident. Evan just nodded along, looking appropriately mysterious while internally screaming about how close they came to losing Europe. A week later, the walkthrough offered a rare, purely beneficial piece of information. Evan was lying on his bed, scrolling through the app, when he found an entry in the financial appendix. Note: in late October, a minor geological survey company named Apex Minerals discovers the largest deposit of rare earth neodymium in North America. Their penny stock, trading at 12 cents, skyrockets to $45 a share within 48 hours of the announcement. Evan checked the date. The announcement was scheduled for tomorrow. Finally, free money, Evan thought. He opened his private brokerage app. He transferred his entire liquid trust fund, roughly $20 million, and bought every available share of Apex Minerals. It was a reckless, absurdly stupid move by any traditional metric. The next afternoon, Evan was sitting in his office, drinking a coffee, when the door opened. Adrian walked in. He wasn't carrying an iPad this time. He was carrying a physical, leather-bound notebook. He placed it reverently on Evan's desk. "What is this?" Evan asked, eyeing the book suspiciously. Adrian tapped the leather cover. "I've been compiling it for a week. I call it Evan's decision-making model. I've documented the Vanguard rejection, the Novashell acquisition, the Gala security protocols, and your handling of the Rotterdam crisis." Evan choked slightly on his coffee. "Adrian, you don't need a notebook for me. I just read the market." "Modesty doesn't suit you, Evan," Adrian said, pacing excitedly. "I finally understand your framework. You don't use linear analytics. You use macro-probabilistic chaos theory. You look at the negative space in the market, the things that aren't happening, to predict what will." "I literally just read a spoiler guide," Evan panicked internally. "Please stop analyzing me. You're going to realize there's no math involved." And then, Adrian continued, his eyes gleaming with fanatic devotion. "I saw your personal portfolio trades from yesterday morning." Evan froze. "Oh no. You liquidated $20 million, Adrian said, leaning over the desk, and dumped it into a penny stock for a defunct mining company in Nevada. Apex Minerals." "Adrian, I can explain." "You don't have to." Adrian laughed, slamming his hand on the desk. "I spent all night trying to find the logic. I looked at their geological data. I looked at their executive board. There was nothing. It was a garbage stock." "Exactly," Evan nodded quickly. "It was just a gamble. A mistake." And then, Adrian whispered, awe creeping into his voice. 10 minutes ago, the Department of Energy announced that Apex Minerals just struck the largest neodymium vein in a century. The stock halted trading because it spiked 4,000%. Evan blinked. "It halted? You just turned $20 million into nearly $1 billion, Evan," Adrian said, shaking his head in disbelief. "In 24 hours. You didn't buy a mining company. You recognized that the global supply chain was artificially suppressing domestic rare earth exploration, and you targeted the only company positioned outside the suppression zone." Adrian grabbed his leather notebook, clutching it like a holy text. "I'm going to study this trade for the rest of my life," Adrian vowed, marching out of the office. Evan sat in silence. He looked at the ceiling. I am going to accidentally become the god of Wall Street, Evan groaned, burying his face in his hands. My brother is writing a religious text about my lucky guesses. His phone buzzed on the desk. Evan picked it up, expecting a notification about his newfound billions. Instead, the walkthrough app was flashing a bright red warning on the home screen. Critical event approaching. Chapter 22. The Kidnapping of Claire Cross. Original event. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., Claire Cross is abducted outside a boutique in Soho by operatives hired by the cartel tied to Richard Vance. A ransom demand is issued. The ransom is paid, but the exchange goes wrong. Claire is severely injured and left with permanent trauma, shattering the family's public image. Evan's blood ran cold. The comedy of the stock market vanished instantly. Tomorrow, 4 p.m., he wasn't going to let anyone touch his sister. Chapter 9. The Kidnapping That Never Happened. The next morning, the Cross penthouse felt suffocatingly normal. Claire was eating a bowl of cereal, scrolling through her phone. She was wearing designer sunglasses indoors and a jacket, clearly preparing to leave for the day. Claire, Evan said, walking into the kitchen. You're not going out today. Claire lowered her sunglasses, giving him a look of profound teenage annoyance. Excuse me? Since when do you manage my schedule, Evan? Did your stock market billions buy you a new ego? I'm serious, Evan said, leaning against the island, crossing his arms to hide his anxiety. Cancel your shopping trip. Stay in the building. Claire scoffed, hopping off a stool. I have a fitting in Soho at 3. I'm taking the driver. I'll be fine. Evan knew she wouldn't listen to him. The original Evan had no authority over her. He had to be ruthless. If you walk out that door, Evan said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat register, I will freeze the black card attached to your trust fund. I will personally call security and have your driver fired. And I will have Dad ground you to this penthouse for a month. Claire stopped walking. She turned around, staring at him. The playful annoyance vanished, replaced by genuine shock. Evan never pulled rank. Evan never threatened her money. You're psycho, Claire whispered, actually intimidated by the icy deadness in his eyes. Stay home, Claire, Evan commanded. He turned and walked away before his resolve broke. He hated talking to her like that, but he would rather she hate him than end up in a hospital. At 3:30 p.m., Evan was pacing his office at Cross Holdings. He was monitoring his phone, waiting for the 4 p.m. mark to pass. He had confirmed with security that Claire was sulking in the penthouse, furious but safe. He had done it. He had broken the narrative again. At 4:15 p.m., his office door opened. Adrian walked in, looking confused. Evan, have you heard from Amelia Hart? Evan stopped pacing. The journalist? No. What? She had a meeting scheduled with the PR department at 4 to discuss an interview about your recent market successes, Adrian said, checking his watch. She never showed up, and her editor just called saying she missed her afternoon check-in. It's unlike her. Evan felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. No, Evan thought. He pulled out his phone. He opened the walkthrough. He navigated to the entry for Chapter 22. The text was no longer static. It was physically glitching, the letters blurring and rewriting themselves right in front of his eyes. Updated event. With Claire Cross isolated, the cartel operatives pivot to a secondary target investigating the Cross family. Amelia Hart is abducted outside the Cross Holdings lobby at 3:55 p.m. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The future is reacting, Evan realized, the sheer horror of the situation crashing over him. The universe requires a tragedy. If I shield one target, the narrative just redirects the bullet to someone else. Amelia had been taken because he saved Claire. He had painted a target on a woman who was just trying to do her job. Adrian, Evan said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Lock down the building. Give me the security footage for the front plaza for the last 30 minutes. Now, Adrian saw the look in his brother's eyes. It wasn't the look of a financial genius. It was the look of a man going to war. Doing it, Adrian said, turning and sprinting out of the office. Evan grabbed his coat. He couldn't rely on the app to fix this. The app had caused this. He had to clean up his own mess. Chapter 10. The Walkthrough Glitch. The security footage showed it perfectly. At 3:55 p.m., a black van pulled up to the plaza outside Cross Holdings. Amelia Hart was grabbed, pulled inside, and the van sped off before anyone could react. Evan sat in the security hub, staring at the frozen frame of the van's license plate. It's a stolen plate, the head of security reported grimly. NYPD is running grid searches, but if they switch vehicles, she's gone. Evan pulled his phone out under the desk. The original timeline stated Claire was taken to an abandoned shipping facility in Red Hook. Would the cartel take Amelia to the same place? He opened the app. He checked the updated entry. Location, Red Hook Facility, Warehouse 4. Thank God, Evan thought. The location hadn't changed. He didn't wait for the police. He couldn't explain how he knew the location without exposing the walkthrough, and every minute counted. He grabbed the keys to one of the armored company SUVs and left the building. The drive to Red Hook was a blur of adrenaline and rain. The sky had opened up, turning the decaying industrial district into a bleak, cinematic nightmare. Evan parked 2 blocks away. He pulled a heavy steel flashlight from the SUV's emergency kit. It wasn't a gun, but he wasn't John Wick. He was a guy who used to work in IT. He crept toward Warehouse 4. The app provided a blueprint of the building in the original timeline. Guard rotation, 2 at the front door, 1 at the rear loading dock. Hostage held in the central office. Evan slipped around to the rear loading dock. He checked the app. 1 guard. He peeked around the rusted metal corner. There were 3 guards, heavily armed. Evan froze, pulling back into the shadows. 3. The app said 1. He looked at his phone. The screen was flickering violently. Warning, original timeline no longer matches current reality. Timeline deviation, 15.2%. Adaptive environmental changes detected. Threat level increased due to host interference. The walkthrough was breaking down. Because Evan had forced the cartel to pivot their target, their operational parameters had changed. They brought more muscle. They changed the guard rotation. The map was useless. He was flying entirely blind. Think, Evan, think. He muttered to himself, rain soaking his hair. He wasn't a tactical genius. What would Adrian do? What would Victor do? They would use leverage. Evan looked at the electrical junction box mounted on the exterior wall of the warehouse. He didn't need to fight 3 men. He just needed them to move. Evan raised the heavy steel flashlight and smashed it brutally into the rusty padlock of the junction box. He ripped the door open, grabbed a heavy piece of debris from the ground, and smashed the main breaker switches. Sparks exploded in the rain. Instantly, the entire warehouse plunged into absolute darkness. Shouts echoed from inside. Check the breaker. Out back. A voice yelled from within. The 3 guards at the loading dock spun around, turning their flashlights toward the junction box. Evan didn't wait for them. As they moved toward the sparks, he slipped past them in the pitch-black rain, diving through the open loading dock doors into the warehouse. It was a maze of wooden crates and rusted machinery. He crept forward, relying entirely on the chaos he had just created. He heard a muffled shout from the center of the warehouse. The central office. Evan moved silently, the adrenaline masking his fear. He reached the glass-walled office. Inside, illuminated by the glow of a single battery-powered lantern, was Amelia Hart. She was tied to a chair, a gag over her mouth, looking terrified but furious. 1 man was guarding her, looking out the glass walls toward the commotion at the back. Evan didn't overthink it. He stepped into the doorway, raised the heavy steel flashlight, and swung it as hard as he could at the back of the guard's knee. The man screamed, his leg buckling. As he dropped, Evan brought the heavy metal down on the back of his head. The guard collapsed out cold. Evan dropped the flashlight, his hands shaking violently. He rushed to Amelia, ripping the gag off and untying her hands. Evan. Amelia gasped, coughing. What are you doing here? How did you find me? I read the writing on the wall, Evan said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound like a billionaire badass. We have to go? Now. He grabbed her hand, and they sprinted out of the office, navigating the dark maze of crates just as the backup generator kicked in, bathing the warehouse in red emergency light. Gunfire erupted behind them, splintering the wooden crates as the guards realized the hostage was gone. Keep running, Evan yelled, pulling her toward a side exit he had memorized from the outdated blueprint. Thankfully, the door was still there. They burst out into the rain, sprinting toward the parked SUV. Evan shoved her into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, and slammed on the gas, tearing away from the docks just as the cartel operatives spilled out of the warehouse. They drove in silence for 10 minutes, the sound of the rain hammering against the armored glass. Amelia finally caught her breath. She looked over at Evan. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He wasn't an unshakable mastermind. He was a guy who had just risked his life for her. "You knew," Amelia whispered, staring at him. "You knew they were going to take me." "I didn't," Evan said, his voice raw. "I thought they were going to take my sister. I grounded her. They took you instead." Amelia's eyes widened. The pieces clicked together in her brilliant investigative mind. The gala, the stock market, the sudden, impossible rescue. "You aren't just smart, Evan," Amelia said softly. "You know things before they happen." Evan didn't answer. He couldn't. He pulled out his phone at a red light. The walkthrough icon was glowing. The text on the screen had changed. Timeline deviation, 18%. Warning, the author has noticed your interference. Evan stared at the screen, a new, profound terror washing over him. The author? Evan thought. Who the hell is the author? Chapter 11, The Ride Home. The drive back to Manhattan was agonizingly silent. Amelia sat in the passenger seat of the armored SUV, wrapped in a blanket Evan had found in the emergency kit. She was shivering, but her eyes were fixed on him, sharp and calculating. Evan kept his eyes on the road. The red warning on his phone. Warning, the author has noticed your interference. Was burning a hole in his pocket. The author, Evan thought, gripping the steering wheel. I'm in a web novel. A badly written, melodramatic web novel. And the guy writing it is actively trying to kill me. You didn't call the police, Amelia said suddenly, breaking the silence. I didn't have time. Evan lied smoothly. You also knew exactly which warehouse to go to. And you knew to hit the breaker box to draw the guards outside. She leaned slightly closer. You don't have a private intelligence network, Evan. I checked. You don't have the infrastructure. I have excellent intuition. You have precognition, Amelia corrected, her voice dead serious. Or something very close to it. Evan's heart hammered against his ribs. If she published that he was a psychic or a time traveler, he'd be locked in a government lab by Tuesday. Ms. Hart, Evan said, his voice dropping into the icy, untouchable billionaire persona he had perfected. If you print that I can see the future, you will end your career. People will think you're insane. They will call you a hack. Amelia stared at him. She knew he was right. I won't print it, Amelia said softly. On one condition. Evan glanced at her. Name it. Exclusive rights, she said, the investigative journalist in her waking back up. You are fighting a war with someone. I don't know who. But you are anticipating moves on a global chessboard. When the dust settles, I want the exclusive interview. The whole story. The whole story is that I have a magical smartphone, and I'm currently fighting a literal fiction writer, Evan thought. Deal, Evan said aloud. Now please, do not tell my family I fought 3 cartel members with a flashlight. They think I'm a financial analyst, not Batman. An hour later, Evan pulled into the underground garage of Cross Tower. He walked out of the elevator onto the executive floor, Amelia right beside him. The entire floor was in a state of sheer panic. Police officers were everywhere. Adrian was shouting at a detective. Victor was on 2 phones at once. Adrian, Evan called out. The entire floor went dead silent. Adrian spun around. When he saw Evan and Amelia standing there, looking disheveled but unharmed, his jaw dropped. Amelia, Adrian gasped, rushing forward. Are you all right? The police have been searching the city for 2 hours. I'm fine, Amelia said, shooting a glance at Evan. Evan found me. Victor slowly lowered his phones. He looked at Evan's rain-soaked coat and the faint bruise forming on his jaw where he had bumped it on a crate. You found her? Victor asked, his voice low and dangerous. The NYPD couldn't find her. How did you? Evan panicked. He needed an excuse. A smart, billionaire excuse. I tracked her phone's micro-frequency ping off the cartel's secondary cell towers, Evan blurted out, using words that sounded vaguely technological. Adrian stared at him. He slowly pulled out his leather notebook. You isolated a micro-frequency in a metropolitan grid. Adrian whispered, sheer awe in his voice. And you executed a solitary tactical extraction to avoid alerting their primary security forces? I hit a guy with a flashlight, Adrian. Evan screamed internally. Something like that, Evan said coolly, dusting off his coat. It was the logical move. Adrian furiously scribbled in his notebook. The logical move. Incredible. Evan closed his eyes. I am never going to escape this. Chapter 12. The False Flag. The next morning, Evan woke up in his penthouse, feeling like he had run a marathon. He immediately reached for his phone and opened the walkthrough. He needed to understand what the author warning meant. The screen loaded, but the golden hourglass icon was glitching, flashing red intermittently. The index was completely scrambled. Chapter 23. The Fall of the Asian Markets. Chapter 24. Victor cross-chokes on a pretzel. Chapter 25. A meteor hits Cross Tower. Evan stared at the screen in horror. A meteor? Evan yelled aloud. You can't just drop a meteor on a financial thriller. He tapped the meteor entry. Result. Just kidding. But I'm watching you, Evan. Evan dropped the phone on his bed like it was on fire. The author was communicating with him. The author was pissed. Because Evan kept saving the family, the author's tragic plot was being ruined. He's going to try to trick me, Evan realized. The walkthrough is compromised. I can't trust it blindly anymore. His phone buzzed. It was a standard text from Adrian. Evan, emergency meeting in Dad's office. 10 minutes. Bring your intuition. Evan sighed, put on a suit, and headed up. When he walked into Victor's office, Adrian was pointing at a massive stock chart on the wall. The chart showed a tech company called Helios Energy. Its stock was skyrocketing. Helios Energy just announced a breakthrough in solid-state batteries, Adrian said, pacing excitedly. The market is going crazy. Goldman Sachs is predicting a 300% return by Friday. Dad wants to authorize a massive buy-in. $2 billion. Evan frowned. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and sneakily opened the walkthrough under the table. He searched Helios Energy. The app generated a response instantly. Author's note. Helios Energy is a flawless investment. Tell your brother to buy it. Buy as much as possible. It will definitely not go bankrupt by 4 p.m. today due to a massive SEC fraud investigation. Evan's blood ran cold. The author was trying to bait him. It was a false flag. The sarcasm was dripping off the screen. If Evan told Adrian to buy, the family would lose $2 billion by the afternoon. Evan, Victor asked, looking at his youngest son. What is your read? Evan put his phone away. He looked at the chart. He had to do the exact opposite of what the author wanted. Short it, Evan said flatly. Adrian stopped pacing. Short it. Evan, they just cured battery degradation. The entire automotive industry is clamoring for their patents. Short it. Evan repeated, crossing his arms and leaning back. Short it for $2 billion. Victor's eyes narrowed. That is an incredibly aggressive negative position, Evan. If the stock continues to rise, we could be exposed to infinite losses. It won't rise, Evan said, forcing his voice to remain utterly bored. By 4 p.m. today, Helios Energy will be a crater. Please let me be reading the author's sarcasm correctly, Evan prayed. If I'm wrong, I just bankrupted my family. Adrian looked at his father. Victor looked at Evan. For a long, agonizing minute, the room was silent. Execute the short, Victor commanded. Dad, do it, Adrian, Victor said softly, never taking his eyes off Evan. Evan has earned the right to risk $2 billion. Adrian typed furiously on his iPad, his hands shaking slightly. Done. We are officially short $2 billion on Helios. Evan spent the next 6 hours locked in his own office, sweating profusely, staring at his computer monitor. The Helios stock kept climbing. 10%, 20%. The Cross family was bleeding hundreds of millions in unrealized losses. At 3:55 p.m., Evan was practically hyperventilating into a paper bag. At 3:58 p.m., the stock ticker froze. At 3:59 p.m., the breaking news alert flashed across every terminal in the building. Helios Energy prototypes revealed as fake. SEC raids headquarters. CEO flees country. The stock unfroze and instantly plummeted 95%, hitting rock bottom. Evan slowly lowered the paper bag. His office door burst open. Adrian ran in, looking like he was about to pass out from sheer adrenaline. We made $3 billion, Adrian gasped, clutching his chest. In 6 hours. We made $3 billion. How did you know? Evan quickly minimized the stock chart and pulled up a game of solitaire. I just didn't like their logo, Evan said, his voice trembling slightly. Adrian stared at him, then pulled out his leather notebook. He bases macroeconomic short squeezes on corporate aesthetic branding to predict structural internal instability, Adrian muttered, writing furiously. Genius. Absolute genius. Evan let his head fall onto his desk. I am fighting a god, and my brother thinks I'm Steve Jobs. Chapter 13, The Rival. The author wasn't just going to use bad financial advice. If Evan wouldn't take the bait, the author would bring the fight to him. 3 days later, the Cross family attended a high-stakes charity auction for a prime piece of Manhattan real estate, a vacant block in Hudson Yards. The city was auctioning it off to the highest bidder for commercial development. Victor wanted it. It was the crown jewel of their upcoming expansion. Evan sat between Victor and Adrian in the front row of the auction house. We cap our bid at $1.2 billion, Victor whispered to Adrian. Anything more is a loss leader. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium. Let's open the bidding at $500 million, the auctioneer announced. Adrian raised his paddle. $500 million. Before the auctioneer could acknowledge it, a voice from the back of the room echoed loudly. $1 billion. The entire room turned around. Standing at the back, leaning casually against the mahogany double doors, was a young man in a sharp, blood-red suit. He had slicked back blonde hair, a cruel, mocking smile, and eyes that locked instantly onto Evan. Evan checked the walkthrough app. New character unlocked. Julian Vance. Role: nephew of Richard Vance, Vanguard CEO. Seeking vengeance for his uncle's arrest. Julian is a ruthless corporate raider designed specifically to destroy Evan Cross. Evan's stomach dropped. The author had literally written a new villain into existence just to mess with him. Julian Vance, Victor muttered, his eyes narrowing. Richard's nephew. I thought he was in London. He's here now, Adrian said tightly. And he's trying to price us out instantly. $1 billion to Mr. Vance in the back, the auctioneer said, recovering his composure. Do I hear 1.1? Adrian looked at Victor. Victor nodded. Adrian raised his paddle. 1.1 billion. 1.5 billion, Julian called out lazily, checking his manicured nails. The room gasped. 1.5 billion was a ridiculous overpay. The land wasn't worth that much. Julian was doing this purely out of spite. He wanted to humiliate the Cross family in public. Victor's jaw tightened. Let him have it. It's a toxic asset at that price. He's an emotional fool. Julian smirked, walking slowly down the center aisle. He stopped right next to Evan's chair. Is that it, Victor? Julian mocked, looking down at them. I thought the mighty Cross family had deeper pockets. Or is your new genius son telling you to back down? Julian leaned close to Evan, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know what you did to my uncle, Evan. I'm going to take this land, build a tower twice as high as yours, and watch you jump off of it. Evan looked at Julian. Julian was a classic web novel villain. Arrogant, loud, and prone to dramatic speeches. What would a genius do? Evan thought. A genius would use Julian's ego against him. Evan slowly turned his head to look at Julian. He let out a long, loud, incredibly obnoxious yawn. Julian blinked, taken aback. Excuse me. Evan didn't answer him. He turned to his father. Dad, Evan said, projecting his voice so the entire room could hear. Why are we fighting over a dirt lot? It's boring. Buy it if you want, but I'm going to take a nap. Evan crossed his arms, closed his eyes, and physically slouched down in his chair, pretending to fall asleep. The room was dead silent. Julian Vance, the terrifying corporate raider, had just delivered a death threat, and Evan Cross was taking a nap. The current bid is $1.5 billion from Mr. Vance, the auctioneer stammered. Julian's face turned bright red. The absolute disrespect was burning him alive. He looked at Evan, who was genuinely producing a soft, fake snoring sound. $2 billion. Julian suddenly yelled, slamming his hand on the back of Evan's chair. The room gasped again. Sir, the auctioneer said, confused. You are bidding against yourself. You already hold the highest bid. Julian froze. He realized what he had just done, blinded by rage and the need to prove dominance over a guy who was literally sleeping. He had just bid another $500 million against no one. I meant. Julian stammered, looking around at the wealthy elite who were now openly laughing at him. $2 billion, going once, twice, sold to Julian Vance, the auctioneer said quickly, slamming the gavel before Julian could retract it. Evan slowly opened one eye. He looked up at Julian, who looked like he was about to vomit. Congratulations on your dirt, Julian, Evan said smoothly. Try not to go bankrupt building on it. Julian spun around and practically ran out of the auction house, leaving a $2 billion hole in his own company's finances. Adrian leaned over, clutching his notebook. A masterclass, Adrian whispered reverently. You weaponized his own insecurity and baited him into a self-destructive bidding war by utilizing weaponized apathy. You literally slept your way to a $500 million victory. Evan closed his eyes again. I am so incredibly tired. Chapter 14, The Stalker. The Julian Vance incident made headlines. Evan was hailed as a psychological tactician. But Evan wasn't celebrating. He was paranoid. If the author could spawn Julian Vance, what else could he do? Evan was walking through Central Park on a Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by two of the family's discreet security details trailing 30 feet behind him. He needed fresh air. He needed to think. He pulled out his phone. The walkthrough icon was glowing a dull, angry purple. He opened it. The text on the screen wasn't an index anymore. It was a direct message. $$ message from the author $. You are ruining my pacing, Evan. The Vanguard arc was supposed to take 50 chapters. You resolved it in 2. Julian was supposed to be a major antagonist. You made him a joke in 3 pages. Stop breaking my plot. Evan stopped walking. He typed into the search bar, hoping the app would register it as a reply. What do you want? Evan typed. The screen refreshed. $$ message from the author $. I want a tragedy. I write tragedies, Evan. The Cross family is supposed to fall. That is the narrative design. If you continue to shield them, I will simply escalate the variables until they break. You cannot outsmart the man writing the universe. Evan stared at the screen. The sheer arrogance of it made his blood boil. This wasn't a god. This was a hack writer throwing a tantrum because his characters wouldn't do what they were told. Watch me, Evan whispered to the phone. He typed back. Your pacing is terrible anyway. The phone screen instantly went black. A second later, a loud crack echoed through the park. A massive branch from the ancient oak tree Evan was standing under snapped off, plummeting directly toward his head. Evan didn't have time to think. He dove forward onto the paved path, scraping his hands and tearing his expensive suit jacket as the 1,000-pound branch crashed onto the exact spot he had been standing a millisecond prior. His security detail rushed forward, guns drawn, looking for a shooter. Evan lay on the ground, his heart pounding out of his chest. It wasn't a coincidence. The author had literally tried to drop a tree on him. Mr. Cross, are you all right? One of the guards yelled, helping him up. I'm fine. Evan gasped, looking up at the sky. The author couldn't just strike him down with lightning. That would break the genre rules of a financial thriller. But he could manipulate probability. A weak branch. A speeding car. A poison drink. Evan realized he was fighting a war on 2 fronts. He had to manage his family's corporate empire, and he had to survive a universe that was actively trying to arrange fatal accidents for him. He picked up his phone. The screen turned back on. $$ message from the author $. Oops. Evan shoved the phone into his pocket. The game had changed. It was personal now. Chapter 15, Claire's Investigation. Claire Cross was sitting on the floor of her massive walk-in closet, surrounded by photographs, printouts of stock charts, and a whiteboard covered in red string. She looked like a conspiracy theorist, and she felt like one. It doesn't make sense, Claire muttered to herself, chewing on the end of a red marker. She had spent the last 2 weeks investigating her own brother. She traced his investments. Apex Minerals. Nova Shell. His bizarre, perfect timing at the charity gala. His humiliation of Julian Vance. Every single event was flawless. Too flawless. No one is this lucky, Claire said, drawing a line from a photo of Richard Vance to a photo of the Vanguard logo. And no one gets this smart overnight. For months ago, he thought diversifying a portfolio meant buying cars in different colors. She needed proof. She needed to catch him in the act of being, whatever he was. She slipped out of her room and crept down the hallway toward Evan's home office. The door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside. Evan was sitting at his desk. He looked miserable. He was holding a piece of paper, staring at it like it was a death sentence. Claire pulled out her phone, turned the camera on, and zoomed in through the crack in the door. She focused the lens on the piece of paper Evan was holding. It was a complex, highly detailed schematic of a microchip architecture. What is he doing with engineering schematics? Claire thought, intrigued. Inside the office, Evan was actually looking at a diagram of a coffee maker. The espresso machine downstairs was broken, and he was trying to figure out how to decale it because he didn't want to ask the staff and ruin his genius persona over a coffee machine. Why are there so many tubes? Evan groaned softly, rubbing his temples. It just needs to make hot bean water. Claire couldn't hear him. She just saw the intense, tortured look of a genius grappling with a problem of immense complexity. Suddenly, Evan's phone buzzed on the desk. Claire zoomed in on the phone screen. She couldn't read the text, but she saw the app icon. A glowing golden hourglass. Evan snatched the phone up quickly, looking around paranoid, before reading it under the desk. He's getting instructions, Claire realized, her heart racing. From who? A secret organization? The CIA? Is Evan a corporate spy? She lowered her phone, her mind spinning with wild theories. She had to get her hands on that phone. That glowing hourglass was the key to everything. She crept away from the door, a new, determined glint in her eye. She was going to break into Evan's phone if it was the last thing she did. Chapter 16, The Interview. Amelia Hart sat across from Evan in a plush leather chair in his office at Cross Holdings. It was time for the exclusive interview. So, Amelia said, clicking her pen, "The world wants to know, Evan. How did you do it? How did you transition from a tabloid fixture to the most feared man on Wall Street in less than 6 months?" Evan leaned back in his chair. He had prepared for this. He needed to sound incredibly boring. If the public thought he was boring, maybe the author would get bored of writing him. "It's just basic arithmetic, Amelia," Evan said in a monotone voice. "I read spreadsheets. I sleep 8 hours a day. I eat oatmeal. It's not glamorous." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Oatmeal? Yes. Plain. No sugar. It keeps the mind clear of unnecessary spikes in dopamine, allowing for pure, unadulterated focus on market trends." "I had 3 donuts for breakfast," Evan thought, his stomach rumbling slightly. "Fascinating," Amelia said, writing it down. "And your strategy regarding Julian Vance? The nap tactic?" "I was genuinely tired," Evan lied. "Proper rest is essential for corporate governance." Amelia looked at him. She knew he was full of it, but it was brilliant. "You're rebranding," Amelia realized, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You're shedding the Playboy image by embracing extreme, monk-like minimalism. You're making yourself untouchable by making yourself impenetrable." "I just like oatmeal, Amelia." The article ran the next morning on the front page of the Financial Times. The Zen Billionaire: How Oatmeal and Naps Forged the New Apex Predator of Wall Street. By noon, plain oatmeal had sold out in every high-end grocery store in Manhattan. Wall Street executives were taking tactical naps under their desks. Adrian walked into Evan's office, eating a bowl of plain, gray oatmeal, looking miserable but determined. "It tastes like wet cardboard, Evan," Adrian said, forcing a spoonful down. "But I feel the clarity you spoke of. The dopamine fast is working." Evan stared at his brother. He slowly reached under his desk and quietly pushed the empty box of Krispy Kreme donuts deeper into his trash can. "Stay the course, Adrian," Evan said solemnly. "Greatness requires sacrifice." "I am a fraud," Evan screamed internally. "I am a terrible, terrible fraud." Chapter 17, The Chandelier. The author was not amused by the oatmeal article. That evening, the Cross family was having dinner in their formal dining room. The room was dominated by a massive, antique crystal chandelier hanging directly over the center of the table. Evan was sitting directly under it. He was eating his soup when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He pulled his phone out under the table. $$ message from the author $. "Gravity is a harsh mistress, Evan." Evan didn't look up. He knew exactly what was about to happen. The author was going to drop the chandelier on him. He couldn't just dive out of the way. That would look insane. He needed a reason to move. "Claire," Evan said calmly, looking at his sister across the table. "Could you pass the salt?" "It's right in front of you," Claire said, frowning. "No, the sea salt. On the sideboard." Claire huffed and stood up to get it. As she turned her back, Evan purposefully hooked his foot around the leg of his heavy dining chair. He threw his weight backward, making it look like he had leaned back too far and lost his balance. He fell backward with a loud shout, tumbling onto the thick Persian rug. At the exact millisecond his head cleared the space above the table, the heavy brass chain of the chandelier snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The massive crystal fixture plummeted, smashing into the dining table exactly where Evan had been sitting a second before. Crystal shattered everywhere. Soup exploded across the room. Victor shouted, jumping back. Eleanor screamed. Evan lay on the rug, staring at the glittering shards of glass embedded in the mahogany table just inches from where his skull had been. Evan, Adrian yelled, rushing over and pulling him up. Are you all right? I'm fine, Evan gasped, brushing glass off his pants. I just slipped. Claire stood by the sideboard, holding the salt shaker. She wasn't looking at the broken chandelier. She was looking at Evan. She had seen his eyes before he fell. He hadn't lost his balance. He had deliberately thrown himself backward. He knew it was going to fall. You knew, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos of the security guards rushing into the room. Evan looked at her. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and absolute certainty. He couldn't deny it to her. Not this time. He put a finger to his lips, giving her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Please don't say anything, Evan pleaded with his eyes. Claire slowly lowered the salt shaker. She didn't say a word to the security team, but the investigation into her brother had just shifted from a hobby to a matter of life and death. Chapter 18, The Cyber Attack. The chandelier incident left the family shaken. Victor ordered a complete overhaul of the mansion's structural integrity, firing the maintenance staff. Evan knew it wouldn't help. You can't fire the narrator. The next day at the office, the walkthrough app flashed a bright, frantic yellow. $$ timeline event. The Ghost in the Machine $. Original event. At 2 p.m., a massive cyber attack orchestrated by Julian Vance infiltrates the Cross Holdings mainframe. The ransomware locks down all international shipping manifests, costing the company billions and resulting in the firing of the entire IT department. Evan checked his watch. It was 1:55 p.m. He had 5 minutes to stop a world-class cyber attack. He sprinted out of his office and down the hall toward the main server room on the executive floor. He swiped his badge and burst through the heavy security doors. The room was freezing cold, filled with rows of humming black server racks. Mr. Cross, the head IT technician asked, looking up from his console in surprise. Can I help you? I need you to shut down the external network ports. Now, Evan ordered, trying to sound authoritative. Sir, we can't do that without a direct order from the CEO, the technician frowned. It would disrupt our global communications grid. Evan looked at his watch. 1:58 p.m. There was no time to explain or call his father. He had to do it the stupid way. Evan looked around. He saw the main power conduit connecting the external fiber optic line to the primary server rack. It was a massive, thick black cable plugged into a wall terminal. Hey, Evan said, pointing to a standard wall outlet right next to the massive fiber optic plug. Is that outlet working? My phone is at 2%. The technician blinked. Yes, sir, but you shouldn't. Evan didn't wait. He pulled his phone charger out of his pocket, walked over, and blatantly tripped over his own feet. He lunged forward, his hands flailing. He grabbed the thick black fiber optic cable to steady himself, yanking it completely out of the wall terminal with a loud pop. Instantly, half the lights in the server room flashed red. Sirens began to blare. My God, what did you do? The technician screamed, scrambling out of his chair. You just severed our connection to the outside world. I tripped. Evan yelled over the sirens, dusting himself off. I'm so clumsy today. At that exact second, 2 p.m., the technician's console lit up with a barrage of red warning screens. The technician froze, staring at the monitors. Sir, the technician whispered, the anger vanishing, replaced by sheer horror. What? Evan asked, acting innocent. A massive ransomware payload just attempted to breach our firewall, the technician said, his hands shaking over the keyboard. It was a synchronized, multi-vector attack. It would have bypassed our security in seconds. Oh no, Evan deadpanned. Did it get through? No, the technician said, turning slowly to look at Evan with absolute reverence. It couldn't get in, because the physical connection was severed. You intentionally tripped. I just wanted to charge my phone, Evan said, holding up his white Apple cord. The technician fell to his knees. You are a god among men, Mr. Cross. You foresaw the attack and bypassed protocol to execute a physical hardline sever. I will tell the board of your heroism. Evan sighed heavily. He plugged his phone into the regular outlet. Make sure you get it back online by 3 o'clock, Evan said tiredly, walking out of the screaming server room. Chapter 19, The Dinner Party. Julian Vance was not a man who accepted defeat easily. After failing to outbid Evan and failing to hack his servers, Julian decided to try a different tactic: intimidation. He requested a formal dinner with the Cross family to discuss terms of a potential ceasefire. Victor, ever the pragmatist, accepted, hoping to gauge Julian's remaining capital. The dinner was held at the Cross mansion. Julian arrived looking impeccable, though a vein throbbed slightly in his temple when he saw Evan sitting at the table. The meal was tense. Julian made passive-aggressive comments about market volatility. Victor deflected them with practiced ease. Adrian took notes. Evan just wanted to eat his steak. "So, Evan," Julian said smoothly, cutting into his meat, "I hear you've been having some accidents lately. A falling chandelier? It's a dangerous world out there. One must be careful where they sit." The threat was clear. Julian was claiming credit for the chandelier, even though Evan knew it was the author. Evan looked at Julian. Julian was expecting a retort. He was expecting a battle of wits. Evan reached under the table. The family's golden retriever, Barnaby, had wandered into the dining room, begging for scraps. While Julian continued his monologue about corporate dominance and the vulnerability of the Cross supply chain, Evan quietly cut a piece of his $100 Wagyu steak and held it under the table. Barnaby took it gently. "I have the capital to freeze your European assets for a decade," Julian threatened, leaning forward, trying to command Evan's attention. "I can make sure every regulatory body in the EU audits your subsidiaries." Evan cut another piece of steak. He held it down for Barnaby. "Are you listening to me, Evan?" Julian snapped, his facade cracking. Evan finally looked up. Sorry, Barnaby really likes the Wagyu." Julian stared at him. The absolute, soul-crushing disrespect of being ignored for a dog was too much for his fragile ego. He had prepared for a chess match. Evan was playing fetch. "You think this is a game?" Julian yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "I am going to destroy you. I am going to tear your company apart piece by piece." Evan wiped his mouth with a napkin. He looked at Julian with genuine pity. "Julian," Evan said softly, "you're a secondary character. Stop yelling. You're giving me a headache." Julian's face turned purple. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. "This isn't over," Julian screamed, turning and marching out of the dining room. The front door slammed shut a minute later. Victor looked at Evan. "What did you call him?" "A secondary character," Evan said, tossing the last piece of steak to Barnaby. "He lacks depth." Adrian frantically scribbled in his notebook. "Reduce his rival to a narrative construct to assert psychological dominance." "Brilliant." Claire just stared at Evan across the table, her eyes narrowing. She knew he wasn't crazy. He meant it literally. Chapter 20, The Rewrite. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. The walkthrough app had been silent since the cyber attack. He didn't like the silence. It felt like the calm before a hurricane. At 3 a.m., the phone resting on his nightstand vibrated violently. Evan snatched it up. The screen wasn't just glowing. It was flashing blindingly bright white, hurting his eyes. He unlocked it. The screen was filled with code. Raw, scrolling lines of text moving too fast to read. Then it stopped. A single text box appeared in the center. System override initiated by the author. Evan sat up in bed, his heart hammering in his throat. Message from the author. "You refuse to play your part, Evan. You refuse to die, and you refuse to let them fall. You have rendered my plot unrecognizable. The Vanguard arc is dead. Julian is compromised. The narrative structure is collapsing under the weight of your interference." Evan quickly typed back, "Then stop trying to kill us. Let us just run the company." The response was immediate. Message from the author. "A story without conflict is not a story. It is a ledger. I do not write ledgers. I am offering you a deal, Evan Cross." Evan frowned. "A deal?" Message from the author. "Cease your interference. Allow the natural tragedies of Chapter 30 to occur. If you let the narrative proceed, if you allow Cross Holdings to be dismantled and your father to be indicted, I will rewrite Chapter 87. You will not die on Pier 44. You will survive. You will be written out of the story safely." Evan stared at the glowing screen in the darkroom. It was an out. He could stop fighting. He could stop sweating through his suits, stop avoiding falling chandeliers, stop pretending to be a genius. He could just be Evan again. Average, safe Evan. All he had to do was let the family he had spent the last month saving burn to the ground. He had to let Victor go to prison. He had to let Adrian's dreams shatter. He had to let Claire and Eleanor lose everything. Evan looked up from the phone. He looked at his bedroom door. Beyond that door was a family that, despite being entirely dysfunctional and slightly terrifying, had actually started to respect him. They were his family now. He looked back at the screen. He typed his response. No deal. The screen flashed red. Message from the author. Are you certain? You are choosing to fight the man who controls the weather, the markets, and the laws of physics in your universe. Evan didn't hesitate. I have Adrian, Evan typed back. He's taking notes. We'll be fine. The phone screen went completely black. For a moment, the room was perfectly silent. Then, the text slowly reappeared, glowing and angry, blood red. Catastrophic rewrite initiated. Erasing current antagonist. Generating new threat level. Omega. Good luck, Evan. You're going to need more than oatmeal. The walkthrough app closed itself, and the icon vanished from Evan's home screen completely. Evan sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside his window. The cheat sheet was gone. The guide was deleted. Evan Cross was flying completely blind, and the author was bringing out the heavy artillery. Chapter 21. The Missing Map. The morning after the walkthrough app deleted itself, the real war began. Evan sat at the massive mahogany table in the Cross Holdings executive boardroom. He hadn't slept. He had spent the last 8 hours staring at his blank phone screen, hoping the golden hourglass icon was just buffering. It wasn't. He was officially a normal, terrified 22-year-old wearing a very expensive suit. Adrian burst through the boardroom doors, his tie loosened, holding a glowing tablet. He looked stressed, which, for Adrian, meant he was practically vibrating. They're hitting us, Adrian announced, his voice tight with adrenaline. It's a synchronized shadow campaign. The author's proxies are dumping our logistics stocks, shorting our tech sector, and bribing European regulators to stall our maritime fleet. We're bleeding $50 million an hour. Victor Cross sat at the head of the table, his face carved from granite. He didn't look at the flashing red monitors. He looked at Evan. Evan, Victor said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. The board is panicking. What is the counterplay? Adrian stopped pacing. He looked at his younger brother with absolute, unwavering reverence. Tell me where to strike, Evan. Give me the coordinates. Evan stared at the red numbers cascading across the wall monitors. I don't have coordinates, Evan screamed internally. I don't even know what a maritime regulatory stall is. The cheat sheet is gone. We are flying entirely blind. He had to say something. He had to maintain the mask. We do nothing, Evan said coldly, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair. Adrian blinked. Nothing? Evan, they are tearing apart our supply chain. Let them overextend. Evan lied smoothly, projecting an aura of supreme confidence. They think they are choking us, but they are only exposing their own liquidity networks. Let them bleed their capital into the attack. Brilliant, Victor murmured, a terrifying smile touching his lips. He's drawing them into a war of attrition. We hold the line. I am literally just stalling because I have no idea what else to do, Evan thought, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. Please don't hold the line. Someone please do something smart before we go bankrupt. The boardroom doors opened again. Claire strolled in, blowing a bubble with her pink chewing gum. She was holding a massive, glowing gaming laptop. You guys are so boring, Claire announced, dropping the laptop onto the mahogany table with a heavy thud. Claire, we are in the middle of a corporate siege, Adrian snapped. I know, Claire said cheerfully. And while you two were waiting for Evan's grand master plan, I decided to employ his strategy myself. Evan froze. My strategy? Weaponized apathy mixed with psychological chaos. Claire grinned, pointing at her screen. The author's proxies are using highly advanced predictive algorithms to short our stocks, right? They predict logical corporate defense mechanisms. Yes, Adrian said slowly. So I hacked into our own automated trading grid and changed our defensive buyback parameters, Claire said, popping her gum. Instead of defending our logistics stocks, I authorized the automated system to aggressively purchase 3 bankrupt alpaca farms in Peru, a defunct yo-yo manufacturer in Ohio, and $2 million worth of vintage pogo sticks. The boardroom went dead silent. You bought alpacas? Victor asked, his terrifying CEO persona glitching for a fraction of a second. Yep, Claire said. And the author's predictive algorithm is currently having a total meltdown, trying to figure out the macroeconomic strategic value of Peruvian alpacas. It's dedicating 80% of its processing power to analyzing yo-yos. Their short-selling attack just stalled completely. Adrian stared at the screen. The red cascading numbers had frozen. She broke their algorithm with sheer, unadulterated nonsense. Adrian whispered in awe. He looked at Evan. You told her to do this, didn't you? When you told us to do nothing, you were giving Claire the space to deploy the chaos protocol. Evan looked at his sister. He looked at his brother. Obviously, Evan said, his voice flat. I am surrounded by beautiful, psychotic geniuses, Evan thought, a wave of profound relief washing over him. Thank God I'm related to them. Excellent work, Claire, Victor said proudly. But this only buys us time. The author will recalibrate. Evan nodded slowly. The mask was heavy, and the cracks were showing. He couldn't keep faking this forever. Chapter 22, Amelia Investigates. Evan retreated to a quiet, upscale bar in Midtown, nursing a club soda. He needed to think. He needed to figure out how to survive the next chapter without a walkthrough. Someone slid into the booth across from him. It was Amelia Hart. The investigative journalist didn't have her usual notepad. She wore a sharp trench coat and looked extremely serious. You look terrible, Evan, Amelia noted, ordering a whiskey neat from a passing waiter. Long morning in the alpaca business, Evan muttered. I know about the attack on Cross Holdings, Amelia said, leaning forward. And I know about the letter you received from the author. You told me it was a rival firm trying to rattle you. It is, Evan lied. You're terrified, Amelia said, her sharp eyes slicing right through the billionaire disguise. The confident, untouchable mastermind act is gone. You're sitting in a bar at 2 in the afternoon, looking over your shoulder. She reached across the table. Evan, what is actually going on? Evan looked at her. She was brilliant. She was the only person who hadn't blindly bought into his genius persona from day one. He needed an ally who knew the truth. You won't believe me, Evan said quietly. Try me. Evan took a deep breath. I'm not a genius, Amelia. I'm not a strategic mastermind. I didn't predict the markets using math. I used an app on my phone. Amelia frowned. An app? A walkthrough, Evan explained, his voice barely above a whisper. A complete, chapter-by-chapter record of the future. I knew about the assassin at the gala because I read about it. I knew about Vanguard because it was written down. I've been cheating this entire time. Amelia stared at him. She looked for the joke. She looked for the lie. She found neither. You're telling me you can see the future, Amelia stated flatly. I could, Evan corrected. But the author, whoever built the predictive model, realized I was using the leaked data. They deleted the app. I'm flying blind now. Amelia leaned back in her booth. She crossed her arms. Evan, you are suffering from extreme psychological stress. You've convinced yourself that your own intuition is a magical book. I knew you wouldn't believe me. Because it's insane, Amelia said, keeping her voice down. Predictive algorithms exist, yes, but not to the extent of narrating individual assassinations and market crashes with absolute accuracy. Evan looked at his watch. He closed his eyes, searching the deepest, most useless recesses of his memory from his previous life when he first read the novel. A throwaway detail. A piece of world building from a chapter he hadn't altered. It's 2:14 p.m., Evan said, opening his eyes. Look at the television above the bar. Amelia frowned, turning her head. The television was playing a local news broadcast. The mayor of New York was giving a live press conference on the steps of City Hall regarding a new parks initiative. In exactly 30 seconds, Evan said, his voice completely deadpan. A golden retriever is going to break free from its owner, run through the security perimeter, and the mayor is going to trip over it and fall face first into a wooden podium. Amelia stared at him. That is absurd. Just watch. They sat in silence. 2:14 p.m. turned to 2:15 p.m. On the screen, the mayor was passionately speaking about preserving green spaces. Suddenly, a blur of golden fur shot across the bottom of the screen. A massive, happy golden retriever, trailing a broken leash, bounded up the steps of City Hall. The mayor, startled by the dog running between his legs, stumbled backward, tripped over the dog's tail, and fell spectacularly forward, crashing face first into the podium. The news anchor gasped. The camera shook as people rushed to help. Amelia slowly turned her head back to Evan. Her face was completely pale. The skepticism was gone, replaced by absolute, worldview-shattering shock. How? Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. How did you know that? Because it was written in chapter 28, Evan said softly. I'm not a genius, Amelia. I'm just a guy who read the book. Chapter 23, The Real Purpose. Amelia Hart did not panic. She was a journalist. When faced with an impossible reality, she demanded data. She dragged Evan back to her secure apartment, locked the doors, and pulled out a massive whiteboard. Okay, Amelia said, pacing back and forth with a dry erase marker. Let's assume you aren't psychotic. Let's assume you had a literal script of the future generated by this author entity. I did, Evan said, sitting on her sofa, feeling a profound sense of relief that he finally had someone to talk to. But why? Amelia asked, turning to face him. Why would the author leak the output to you? If he wants to destroy your family, why give you the cheat codes to save them? Evan frowned. He hadn't thought about that. He had been too busy surviving. Maybe it was an accident, Evan suggested. A glitch. People who can predict the future don't make mistakes like that, Amelia said sharply. It was intentional. He gave you the walkthrough on purpose. She began drawing connecting lines on the whiteboard. Think about your actions over the last few months, Amelia urged. What was the net result of every save you executed? I saved my dad's life, Evan said. I saved the company from the Vanguard collapse. I stopped Adrian from giving away the European sector. I bought the lithium monopoly. Exactly, Amelia said, tapping the board. Look at the corporate structure. Before you started interfering, Cross Holdings was decentralized. Victor had power, but the board was fractured. There was debt. There were vulnerabilities. She looked at Evan, her eyes wide with realization. Because of your interventions, Cross Holdings is now the undisputed, monopolistic titan of 3 global sectors. Your father has absolute, unquestioned authority. The company is flush with hundreds of billions in liquid capital. Evan stared at the whiteboard. The cold dread returned, creeping up his spine. He wanted me to fix the company, Evan whispered, the horrifying truth dawning on him. He was fattening the pig, Amelia said, dropping her marker. The original timeline, the collapse of the Cross family, it was going to be messy. It would have taken years. The assets would have been scattered among vultures. Amelia walked over to him, her expression grave. By giving you the walkthrough, the author tricked you into consolidating all the family's wealth, all the power, into one perfectly secure, impenetrable vault. You didn't break his plan, Evan. You built his prize. Evan put his head in his hands. I played right into his hands, Evan thought, nausea washing over him. I thought I was changing the story, but I was just organizing the loot. And now that the vault is full, Amelia said softly. He's going to take it, Evan finished. And he doesn't need me to read the script anymore. Chapter 24, The Dead End. The realization that he had been an unwitting pawn in the author's grand design broke the last of Evan's arrogant facade. He returned to Cross Holdings the next morning feeling like a man walking to his own execution. He walked into the executive boardroom. Victor, Adrian, and Claire were already there, reviewing the morning financials. They looked relaxed, confident, powerful. They had survived the attack yesterday. They felt invincible. Evan, Victor said warmly. Take a seat. Adrian was just going over the quarterly projections. The alpaca farm diversion bought us the time we needed. Evan didn't sit down. It's a trap, Dad, Evan said, his voice flat and exhausted. The room went quiet. A trap. Adrian frowned. Evan, we just posted record profits. The author's proxies are reeling. We have the high ground. We don't have the high ground, Evan said, looking at the massive wall monitors displaying the soaring green lines of Cross Holdings stock. We're standing on a trapdoor, and I helped build it. Before Victor could respond, the massive wall monitors in the boardroom flickered. The green stock lines disappeared. The screens went entirely black. Then, a single line of white text appeared in the center of the monitors. You figured it out, Evan. Too late. Adrian jumped back from the table. Our servers have been breached. Cut the hard lines. It's not a breach, Evan said softly, staring at the screen. It's a message. The text vanished, replaced by a live video feed. An older man, perhaps in his late 60s, sat behind a sleek, minimalist desk. He wore a simple black suit. His hair was silver, his face lined with age, but his eyes were terrifyingly sharp. He exuded the calm, quiet power of a man who didn't just play chess. He owned the board. Hello, Victor. The man's voice echoed through the boardroom speakers. Victor gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white. Arthur Sterling. You son of a bitch. Arthur Sterling? Adrian whispered in shock. The quantitative analytics pioneer? He's supposed to be dead. I prefer the term reclusive. Arthur Sterling smiled slightly. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes finding Evan. And hello to you, Evan, Arthur said. I must say, you exceeded my expectations. I gave you the roadmap, and you navigated it beautifully. You consolidated the lithium markets, secured the logistics grid, and centralized the family's equity. I couldn't have done it better myself. What do you want, Arthur? Victor roared. I don't want anything from you. Victor, Arthur said dismissively. You're a dinosaur. I'm here for the company. The screen split. On the right side, a series of complex financial documents began scrolling rapidly. At 9 a.m. this morning, Arthur explained, I initiated a hostile takeover protocol. Using a network of shell companies, I have simultaneously acquired the majority debt of your 3 primary lending institutions. I am now your sole creditor, and I am calling in the margins. Adrian stared at the scrolling documents, his face turning pale. He's right. The debt covenants allow for immediate acceleration if the creditor consolidates. He's demanding $40 billion in liquid cash by the end of the day. We don't have $40 billion in liquid cash. Victor shouted. It's tied up in the acquisitions Evan told us to make. Exactly. Arthur smiled on the screen. You are asset-rich and cash-poor. A perfect, beautiful target. When you default at 5 p.m. today, my firm will seize Cross Holdings entirely. Thank you for building it for me, Evan. The screen went black. The boardroom was silent. Evan looked at his family. He had led them perfectly, flawlessly, into the ultimate dead end. Chapter 25, The Confession. The silence in the boardroom was heavy enough to crush diamonds. $40 billion by 5 p.m. It was mathematically impossible. Every logical projection, every financial model, pointed to absolute ruin. Adrian collapsed into his chair, pulling at his hair. He played us. Every move we made to protect ourselves just tightened the noose. Victor remained standing, staring at the blank screens. For the first time in his life, the great billionaire patriarch looked defeated. Evan felt a crushing, agonizing weight on his chest. It was his fault. He had relied on the cheat codes. He had thought he was smarter than the game. He looked up at his family. They were waiting for him to do something. They were waiting for the miracle. I'm sorry, Evan said, his voice breaking the silence. Victor turned to look at him. Evan, I don't have a plan, Evan admitted, forcing the words out. The mask finally, completely shattered. I don't have an intuition for this. I can't read the negative space in the market. Every genius move I made, I was cheating. He looked at Adrian, his older brother who had worshipped his strategic mind. I don't know how to fix this, Adrian. I don't know how to fight a master strategist. Evan expected rage. He expected Victor to throw him out of the room. He expected Adrian to scream at him. Instead, Victor walked over. The terrifying CEO placed both hands firmly on Evan's shoulders. Evan, Victor said, his voice steady, grounding, and full of absolute authority. Look at me. Evan looked up, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. I don't care if you used a crystal ball, a magic app, or red tea leaves, Victor said fiercely. You saved my life at that gala. You saved your sister from a kidnapping. You kept this family together. That wasn't a computer algorithm, Evan. That was you. Dad's right, Adrian said, standing up. He walked over, standing beside his brother. The competitive rivalry was entirely gone. You might have had a map, Evan, but you still had to drive the car. Evan looked at his father, then at his brother. The guilt and the terror didn't vanish, but they shifted. They morphed into something harder, something resolute. Arthur Sterling relies on perfect data, Evan said slowly, wiping his eyes. He relies on predictive algorithms to calculate human behavior. He knew I would try to save the company, so he built a trap that weaponized my protective instincts. So how do we beat him? Adrian asked. Evan looked at his phone. He permanently deleted the backup files of his walkthrough notes. We stop cheating, Evan said softly, and we start being irrational. Chapter 26, The Swamp. Irrational? Victor asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Evan said, his voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. Arthur's predictive models are based on the assumption that a billionaire family will always act in their own best financial interest. If we want to break his model, we have to do something that makes absolutely zero financial sense. Claire blew a massive bubble with her gum, popping it loudly. I like where this is going. Adrian, Evan said, turning to his brother. I need you to buy the largest, most useless plot of swampland in Louisiana you can find. Adrian blinked. Swampland? Evan, we have a $40 billion margin call in 5 hours. Why are we buying a swamp? I don't know, Evan said honestly. Adrian stared at him. You don't know? No, Evan said. I have no idea what I'm doing. But neither does Arthur Sterling's algorithm. I am literally just guessing, Evan thought, his internal panic returning in full force. Please let this work. Please let Adrian figure out a reason for this. Adrian stared at Evan for a long, intense moment. A swamp, Adrian muttered, pacing the room. A swamp. Ecological preservation? No. Wait. Mineral rights? No. Adrian stopped pacing. His eyes went wide. Tax depreciation. Adrian yelled, slamming his hand on the table. You brilliant bastard. Evan maintained a perfectly neutral expression. Explain it to the room, Adrian. Please explain it to me, Adrian. I am begging you. If we purchase a massive tract of ecologically protected swampland using the leveraged debt Arthur Sterling just tried to call in, Adrian said rapidly, we can instantly declare a catastrophic depreciation of asset value due to environmental unviability. It legally stalls the margin call by forcing a mandatory federal environmental review that will take 6 months. It buys us time, Victor realized, a vicious smile forming. It freezes Arthur's $40 billion in a bureaucratic nightmare. Exactly, Adrian beamed at Evan. You intentionally chose the most ecologically protected, financially useless landmass in America to weaponize the EPA against Arthur's debt collection. Genius. Of course, Evan said, leaning back in his chair, exuding effortless cool. Thank God Adrian is actually a genius, Evan thought, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Chapter 27, The Dead End. The swamp maneuver bought them exactly 4 hours of breathing room. It wasn't enough to save the company, but it was enough to infuriate Arthur Sterling. At 4 p.m., the boardroom doors opened. Arthur Sterling walked in personally. He was flanked by 2 massive security contractors, but he waved them back, stepping into the room alone. He didn't look like an omniscient mastermind anymore. He looked angry. Environmental reviews? Arthur sneered, looking at Victor. That is a pathetic stalling tactic, Victor. You think a few alligators are going to stop me from seizing Cross Holdings? It stops you today, Victor said calmly, remaining seated. I didn't come here to wait, Arthur said, walking toward the table. He looked at Evan. You've been a thorn in my side since you deviated from the original timeline, boy. You were supposed to drown at Pier 44. You were supposed to die so your father would break. I learned how to swim, Evan said flatly. It doesn't matter, Arthur said, pulling a legal document from his jacket. The environmental review only covers domestic debt. I just routed the margin call through the European Central Bank. The debt is accelerated. At 5 p.m., I own everything you have built. Arthur slammed the document onto the table. Sign the surrender, Victor, Arthur commanded, or I will ensure your children spend the rest of their lives in federal court. The room was heavy with the inevitability of defeat. Arthur had outmaneuvered the swamp. He had outmaneuvered the family. Victor looked at the document. He picked up his gold fountain pen. Dad, Evan said softly. Victor paused. Evan looked at Arthur Sterling, the man who had written the script of their destruction, the man who had played God with their lives. Arthur, Evan said, standing up. Your algorithm predicts everything. Tell me, what is the statistical probability of a billionaire family voluntarily giving away $300 billion? Arthur frowned. 0%. It contradicts basic human self-preservation protocols. Evan smiled. A real, genuine, terrifying smile. Adrian, Evan said, not taking his eyes off Arthur. Execute the irrevocable public trust transfer. Chapter 28, The Final Game. Adrian's hands flew across his tablet. What are you talking about? Arthur asked, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. You want Cross Holdings, Arthur, Evan said, his voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. You want the lithium monopoly. You want the tech sector. You want it because it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Evan looked at Victor. Dad, Evan said. We don't liquidate. We donate. Adrian gasped, stepping back as if he had been slapped. If we put the primary assets in an irrevocable public trust, they can't be seized by private creditors. They belong to the public domain forever. And their market value drops to zero for a corporate raider, Victor realized, a vicious, delighted smile spreading across his face. We lose the company, Evan said, looking at his father. We lose the empire. But Arthur gets nothing. He spent $40 billion to buy our debt, and his collateral evaporates into a charity. It's financial suicide, Adrian whispered in awe. It breaks every rule of corporate logic. The algorithm couldn't predict it. Victor Cross looked at his sons. He looked at his daughter. I built this company from nothing, Victor said proudly. I can build it again. Let's show Arthur what human irrationality looks like. Victor pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner on his desk, authorizing the blanket transfer that Amelia had hastily prepared in the background earlier that morning. Done, Adrian confirmed. At 4:50 p.m., the news hit the wire. The financial networks completely melted down. Cross Holdings transfers entire corporate asset portfolio to nonprofit public trust. Billionaire Dynasty voluntarily surrenders control. Arthur Sterling stared at the glowing tablet in Adrian's hand. You, Arthur whispered, pure, unadulterated shock washing over his face. You just gave it away. You gave away $300 billion. Asset value depreciated to zero. Arthur, Evan mocked coldly. Your collateral is nullified. At 5 p.m., the margin call triggered, but there was nothing to seize. Arthur Sterling was left holding $40 billion of toxic debt against a company that essentially no longer existed as a profitable entity. His firm was instantly, irrevocably bankrupt. Chapter 29, The Future That Never Existed. Arthur Sterling stumbled backward, clutching his chest. You burned the castle down just to deny me the throne. Arthur rasped, staring at Evan with pure hatred. It makes no logical sense. Logic is overrated, Evan said, stopping a few feet away. You relied on a machine to tell you how people work. But a machine doesn't understand that I would rather be broke than let you hurt my family. You were never supposed to survive Chapter 87. Arthur hissed, his composure completely broken. Then Chapter 87 was badly written, Evan sneered. Before Arthur could respond, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. A dozen FBI agents, led by a stern-looking director, flooded into the room, weapons drawn. Amelia Hart walked in behind the agents, holding her notepad, looking extremely satisfied. I gave them the real Cayman files, Arthur, Amelia said, smiling at the old man. Trace straight to your defunct shell companies. The fake ones you used to blackmail Adrian were just a sloppy cover. The agents grabbed Arthur, securing his hands behind his back. The mastermind who had tried to play God with the global economy was dragged out of the building, screaming obscenities at Evan. Evan watched him go. He let out a long, heavy breath, the tension of the last several months finally leaving his body. He wasn't acting. He wasn't relying on a walkthrough. He had actually won. Amelia walked over to him, slipping her notepad into her pocket. Not bad. For a guy who used to read the spoiler guide. Amelia smiled. I had a lot of help. Evan smiled back. Can I buy you a drink? I think I can still afford a beer before my credit cards decline. Amelia laughed. You're buying. Chapter 30, The Genius. Months later, the fallout of the Evan maneuver was legendary. The Cross family had lost Cross Holdings, but Victor Cross wasn't a man who stayed defeated. Within 3 months, he launched a new venture, Cross Innovations. It was smaller, leaner, and terrifyingly efficient. The family was forced to move out of the massive Manhattan penthouse and into a slightly less massive, but still incredibly luxurious, townhouse on the Upper East Side. Evan walked into the living room, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. He looked rested. He looked happy. Morning, Evan said, grabbing a mug of coffee. Morning, genius, Adrian smirked from the kitchen island, tapping on his laptop. I was just reviewing the Q1 projections for the new logistics startup. Do you have any intuitions you'd like to share? My intuition tells me you need to sleep more, Evan said, taking a sip. He's lost his touch. Claire sighed dramatically from the sofa. Without a multi-billion-dollar company to gamble with, he's just an ordinary, boring older brother. Evan smiled into his mug. They had no idea how accurate that statement was. Later that evening, after the house was quiet, Evan was sitting in the small, private library, reading a physical book. Fiction. He found he enjoyed fiction much more when it wasn't predicting his impending doom. The door creaked open. Claire poked her head in. "Hey, you busy?" "Just reading," Evan said, putting the book down. "What's up?" Claire walked in, holding her phone. She looked unusually hesitant. "I wanted to ask you something," Claire said, sitting in the armchair opposite him. "About everything. The last few months." Evan braced himself. "Okay. You knew about the sniper," Claire said softly. "You knew about the Vanguard fraud. You knew about my kidnapping. I had good intelligence." Evan offered his standard, weak excuse. Claire stared at him. Her sharp, chaotic eyes were entirely serious. "I hacked the encrypted files from Arthur Sterling's server before the FBI seized them," Claire said quietly. "I read the logs of his algorithm, Evan. It generated text. Like a story. It predicted you." Evan didn't say a word. He couldn't lie to her anymore. "Evan," Claire whispered. Did you have the output? Did you know what was going to happen to us?" Evan looked at his younger sister. He slowly nodded. "Yes," Evan said softly. "I had a walkthrough. An app on my phone. It told me the future. I used it to stop the bad things from happening." Claire stared at him, processing the monumental revelation. Her brother wasn't a psychic. He wasn't a 12D chess master. He was just a guy with a cheat sheet. A slow, wide, incredibly mischievous smile spread across Claire's face. "I knew it," Claire whispered, her eyes lighting up with delight. "I knew you weren't that smart." Evan groaned, letting his head fall back against the chair. "Are you going to tell Dad and Adrian? Are you kidding?" Claire laughed, standing up. "Adrian has a literal leather-bound shrine dedicated to your strategic genius. If I tell him you were just reading a PDF, his brain will melt. No, this is our secret." She walked over and hugged him tightly. "Thank you for reading the spoilers, Evan." "You're welcome, kid." Evan smiled, hugging her back. Claire pulled away, walking toward the door. She stopped, looking back over her shoulder with a wicked grin. "So," Claire asked casually, "was our entire family breakfast schedule also in the walkthrough? Because if you knew I was going to put salt in the waffles that one time and you let me do it, I'm going to be very upset." Evan froze. His face turned pale. You put salt in the waffles?" Evan asked, horrified. Claire burst into chaotic laughter and sprinted down the hallway. Evan sat in the library, shaking his head, a genuine smile on his face. He loved this family. Suddenly, the screen of his smartphone, sitting on the side table, lit up. The room was silent. Evan slowly turned his head. His phone hadn't buzzed with a text message. It hadn't rung with a call. The screen was glowing with a soft, familiar blue light. "New game plus walkthrough available." Evan stared at the glowing blue text. He thought about the stress. He thought about the terror, the assassins, the heart-stopping panic of trying to outsmart a machine. "No," Evan thought. He swiped his thumb across the screen and hit delete. He tossed the phone onto the sofa, picked up his paperback book, and started reading. 3 seconds later, a shout echoed from upstairs. "Evan," Claire yelled. "Did you eat my leftover cake?" Evan froze. Oh God. He slowly looked back toward the phone. Maybe I should have kept the walkthrough. If you enjoyed Evan's completely accidental journey from useless heir to genius mastermind, don't forget to subscribe to Story Heaven. More stories are coming, and knowing Evan, he'll probably need another walkthrough.